I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
Today, Monday, January 12th, marks a deeply consequential moment for Sean Diddy Combs. Without advance notice, without promotion or build-up, Netflix quietly released Part 2 of Sean Combs, The Reckoning. No countdown, no press circuit, no celebratory rollout. It simply arrived. And when something this significant appears without noise, it's rarely aimed at casual viewers. It's meant for those who already understand the implications. This release isn't presented as a sequel. It feels more like an escalation. Unlike the first installment, it doesn't lean on narration or guided interpretation. It leans on evidence, footage that was never supposed to resurface, phone calls never intended to be heard again, images, party scenes, planning discussions, moments captured under the assumption that the cameras and their consequences would never matter. For the first time, Jay-Z's name is no longer peripheral. It no longer exists at the edge of the story. It now sits uncomfortably close to what's shown on screen. To understand why this matters, you have to rewind to December 2nd, 2025. That's when Netflix debuted the original 4-part documentary Sean Combs, The Reckoning. Viewers believed they were seeing the complete picture, a meticulously structured examination of Combs' rise, his empire, the allegations surrounding him, and the federal investigation closing in. The series included footage shot just days before his arrest. Produced by 50 Cent's G-Unit Films, alongside House of Nonfiction, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Then something unexpected happened. There was no public brawl over the narrative, no loud defenses, no dramatic counteroffensives. Instead, people went quiet. Statements became sparse, public appearances more controlled. The tone of conversation subtly but noticeably shifted. Still, even then, there were omissions, scenes that ended too soon, names dropped without explanation, questions raised and never revisited, and 50 Cent never pretended otherwise. In interviews and casual remarks often overlooked, he repeated the same message. What viewers saw wasn't everything. It was only what could be shown at the time. Part 2 gives that statement new weight. This release doesn't introduce itself. It doesn't summarize or contextualize. It assumes you remember December, and more importantly, it assumes you remember what was left unresolved. There's no hand-holding, no effort to soften the experience. Instead of accelerating, the pacing slows. Moments are placed next to one another and allowed to sit. Clips that once seemed disconnected now feel deliberately linked. Conversations that once sounded benign suddenly feel charged, not because the documentary tells you they are, but because your own memory begins connecting the dots. The timing only intensifies the effect. This didn't arrive during a lull. It landed while legal appeals remain active, while civil lawsuits tied to Combs continue quietly in the background, while the public narrative is still unsettled. At this stage, silence isn't neutral, it becomes evidence. One of the most striking changes in this chapter is where the camera chooses to dwell. Public spectacles fade into the background. There are no red carpets, no award shows, no polished interviews. Instead, the focus shifts to transitional spaces, after parties, private exchanges, moments just before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. These are the scenes usually cut not because they're explosive, but because they become dangerous when rearranged. That's where the weight builds. The documentary doesn't pursue shock for its own sake. It creates pressure through closeness. The same people in the same rooms across different years, the same tone carried into very different circumstances, the same confidence, unchanged by context. Repetition like this rarely feels accidental, and repetition is how patterns reveal themselves. What's most unsettling is how little explanation is offered. Long stretches pass without commentary. You're shown who was there, where they were, and how often these groupings recur. No conclusions are stated outright, but your mind starts drawing them anyway. When events are stacked together instead of separated by time, the gaps vanish. And without gaps, forgetting becomes nearly impossible. There's also a clear emotional shift from the first installment. The December release felt like exposure. This one feels like consequence. It's colder, more restrained, almost resigned, as though the story has moved beyond outrage and into a phase where reality quietly hardens. Outrage burns quickly, records endure. Before moving forward, consider this. If videos, recordings, and images exist and no one directly addresses them, is that silence accidental or strategic? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to follow how this unfolds before the headlines catch up, make sure you're subscribed. Another telling detail is how carefully this release has been met publicly. There's been no aggressive effort to suppress it, no sweeping legal offensives, only measured statements suggesting the narrative has been distorted. That restraint raises a question of its own. If nothing here carries weight, why allow implication to linger rather than confront it head on? This chapter doesn't accuse. It doesn't escalate through claims. It simply refuses to let moments exist in isolation. It compresses time. It removes the spaces where stories once faded away. And when those spaces disappear, consistency becomes visible, not consistency of behavior, but consistency of avoidance, of knowing exactly how much to reveal and how much to withhold. Halfway through, something shifts. You stop watching to see what happens next. You start watching to observe how people behave. Now that awareness has changed, reactions, or the absence of them, begin to communicate more than any single clip ever could. This is where the documentary becomes truly dangerous, not to individuals, but to systems. Systems that depend on time to dull memory. Systems that assume attention will drift before connections fully form. That assumption is failing. Viewers aren't responding emotionally anymore. They're watching analytically, comparing, replaying, noticing how often explanations stop just short of specificity. Nothing about this feels hurried. That's deliberate. Speed invites error. Patience invites scrutiny. And scrutiny doesn't disappear when the screen goes black. It lingers. By the time this section ends, something becomes clear without ever being spelled out. The story no longer needs fresh revelations to survive. It's sustained by what already exists and by what remains unanswered. Silence stops acting as protection. It begins to function as evidence. From this point forward, every action is interpreted differently, not because anything new has been proven, but because the pattern is no longer obscured by time or distance. Once it's visible, it can't be unseen. That's where the pressure truly begins. When that pressure takes hold, the story stops feeling like media and starts behaving like record. It's a transition most people don't immediately notice. There's no explosive moment, no single clip that dominates the conversation. Instead, the weight accumulates slowly through repetition, through familiar responses resurfacing years apart, through explanations that orbit clarity without ever arriving. This portion of the documentary refuses a linear path. It doesn't unfold chronologically like most exposés. It moves laterally. Moments from different eras are placed side by side without warning. A past interview sits next to present-day silence. A confident declaration from years ago is followed by a carefully constructed non-answer now. Individually, each moment feels defensible. Together, they feel deliberate. That's when the internal shift happens. You stop asking what happened. You start asking why the same response appears every time pressure builds. That question is more unsettling because it doesn't require proof, it requires recognition. One of the documentary's quiet strengths is its use of absence. Not only what's shown, but who is missing. Figures once central drift to the margins. Voices that once spoke freely grow, restrained, or vanish altogether. When absence repeats, it stops feeling accidental and starts feeling strategic. The film never says this outright. It doesn't have to. It trusts the audience to recognize the pattern on their own. And conclusions reached independently carry more weight. They don't feel imposed, they feel earned. Another layer emerges gradually. How narratives were handled over time. Not denied, but managed. Certain controversies surfaced briefly, just long enough to release pressure, then were left unresolved. Statements arrived without timeline, clarifications without detail. And time was allowed to accomplish what explanations could not distance. Distance dulls urgency. Urgency is difficult to control. What this chapter quietly reveals is how often distance itself became the solution, not to answer questions, but to outlast them. As these moments accumulate, something else becomes noticeable. The language stays consistent, even as circumstances shift. The tone remains measured. Absolutes are avoided. Nothing untrue is said, but nothing complete is said either. Incompleteness becomes a feature, not a flaw, and incompleteness is protective. Complete narratives invite scrutiny. Incomplete ones ask for patience. Patience benefits those who already hold power. The documentary shows this without explanation. Accountability is acknowledged in theory, then redirected in practice. Concern is expressed broadly while specifics remain just out of reach. Responsibility is discussed without ever being assigned. What makes this unsettling is how familiar it feels, not just here, but across the industry. A controversy emerges. A brief response follows. Attention peaks, then fades. The story is quietly deemed handled, but handled doesn't mean resolved, it means deferred. By compressing years of these moments into a single viewing experience, the documentary strips away the illusion of resolution. Gaps that once felt natural now feel conspicuous. Pauses feel extended. Silences grow heavier not because of what they conceal, but because of how reliably they recur. At this stage, the viewer's role shifts again. You're no longer watching to learn, you're watching to verify. Each new clip is weighed against memory. Each statement is compared to its earlier version. Each decision not to engage becomes part of the record. This is the moment when power typically expects attention to drift, when momentum should fade, when audiences should move on. But that's not what happens here. Instead, the pressure tightens. The film leans into repetition, not of footage, but of behavior. The same responses across different crises, the same reliance on reputation to bridge missing information, the same assumption that time will soften perception. This repetition doesn't feel dramatic, it feels procedural. And procedure implies design. What's most uncomfortable is realizing how effective this strategy has been for so long. Not because anyone was misled, but because deception was never required. The system only needed to slow things down, let discomfort dissipate, let memory blur, let attention wander. For years, it worked. This chapter exposes how silence was never passive. It was active, timed, placed, appearing precisely when clarity would have forced alignment between narratives better kept apart. You begin noticing how often explanations stop just short of specificity, how frequently timelines are avoided, how accountability is replaced with generalized language. Nothing provable, nothing deniable, just incomplete. And when incompleteness repeats, it stops feeling incidental. It becomes method. The documentary doesn't rush toward resolution. It stays in the unease. It allows the viewer to sit with the realization that many moments once treated as isolated incidents were, in fact, part of a continuous pattern. Once that realization settles in, familiar material changes shape. What once sounded confident now feels rehearsed. What once felt like distance now reads as intention, not because new facts have emerged, but because patterns begin to replace coincidence. The story doesn't grow louder here, it grows heavier. You stop searching for a revelation and start studying reactions. Who speaks? Who stays quiet? Who recalibrates their language? Who creates space? At this stage, silence no longer feels like restraint. It feels like a decision. That's when the center of gravity shifts. The narrative no longer belongs to the people within it. It belongs to time, to memory, comparison, and context. Absences become noticeable. Pauses are counted. Non-responses add pressure instead of diffusing it. Not through spectacle, but through repetition. And once repetition is recognized, it can't be ignored. By the end of this section, the viewer understands something without being instructed. The story isn't sustained by new disclosures. It's sustained by unresolved history. And unresolved history doesn't disappear when attention fades. It waits. The tension now comes from measurement, not revelation. The documentary slows its pace not to heighten drama, but to broaden perspective. The question shifts from what happened next to why so many moments were allowed to pass without resolution at all. The focus widens from individual actions to systemic behavior, not one choice or one night, but a consistent way of handling pressure over time. A familiar cycle emerges. A controversy breaks. A tension spikes. A response follows, measured, partial, incomplete. Then time intervenes and quietly absorbs the rest. Time becomes the cleaner. The film presents this not as chance, but as routine. A routine refined over years and reinforced by reputation. When a reputation is strong enough, it fills in the blanks on its own. People assume answers exist somewhere, even if they've never heard them. Assumption replaces evidence. Comfort replaces clarity. Once identified, the pattern feels uncomfortably familiar. Silence is read as dignity. Distance as growth. Unanswered questions are dismissed as outdated simply because time has passed. But time doesn't resolve stories, it spaces them apart. By compressing decades into a single narrative flow, the documentary erases that spacing. The gaps become visible. Pauses that once felt organic now feel intentional. Answers that once seemed sufficient now feel engineered. At this point, the film becomes less about information and more about contrast. Public confidence versus private restraint. Statements on record versus decisions off camera. Moments when engagement could have clarified and the choice not to engage instead. The documentary never accuses deception. It highlights separation, and separation creates plausible deniability. It allows multiple interpretations to coexist without ever confronting one another. As these contrasts accumulate, the viewer begins to understand how narratives endure, not by controlling every detail, but by controlling participation. If you don't engage, you don't create new material. Without new material, old material remains unresolved rather than challenged. That unresolved space is where power is most comfortable. What gives this section its force is restraint. There's no score guiding emotion, no captions spelling out conclusions. Scenes are simply placed side by side, and the friction between them does the work. That friction generates heat. Past interviews resurface and feel altered. Answers that once sounded firm now feel incomplete. Statements once accepted at face value now feel selective, not untrue, but limited. And selection itself is a form of control. The documentary also draws attention to how responsibility is often acknowledged in the abstract, but never assigned in the specific. Concern is expressed, regret implied, yet accountability remains unanchored. This isn't framed as proof of guilt. It's framed as evidence of a method built on patience, on letting attention exhaust itself, on trusting that curiosity will fade before coherence is demanded. For a long time, that method succeeded. But something changes here. Viewers stop reacting emotionally and begin observing structurally. The question shifts from, "Is this true?" to, "Why does the response always follow the same shape?" That shift is quiet, but it can't be undone. The film leans into repetition again, not of images, but of behavior. The same language resurfacing years apart, the same tone applied to unrelated situations, the same distance maintained regardless of context. This repetition doesn't shock. It persuades, because predictability removes the possibility of accident. Here, silence takes on a different meaning. It's no longer neutral. It's no longer passive. It becomes a signal that clarity would be more disruptive than comfort, that finishing certain conversations carries more risk than avoiding them. That distance still feels safer than alignment. The documentary never states this outright. It trusts the viewer to arrive there independently. And conclusions reached this way endure. They don't fade when the screen goes dark. At this point, the story no longer needs speed. It has gravity. Gravity doesn't rush, it pulls. You feel it in the slowing pace, in the silences that stretch just long enough to reveal who's at ease within them and who isn't. That contrast becomes central. Some speak in broad strokes. Others retreat into generalities not because they lack answers, but because specifics create reference points, and reference points invite comparison. Comparison is the real threat. The film shows how clarity was postponed rather than denied, how explanations were deferred, how later rarely arrived, and how delay, repeated often enough, begins to resemble avoidance. This is where the audience shifts from consuming to evaluating, measuring tone, timing, and how narratives adjust as pressure builds quietly, internally. And pressure does build, not online, not through outrage, but inside structures that once depended on time to blur detail. Time isn't blurring anything anymore. Old footage carries new weight. Statements that once felt neutral now feel constructed, not dishonest, but designed to say just enough without ever closing the loop. That tension runs beneath this entire section. Nothing explodes. And that's precisely why it worked. Explosions fade. Patterns persist. By now, the viewer understands something subtle but powerful. This story no longer belongs to headlines. It belongs to memory. And memory doesn't reset when attention moves on. As the story reaches this point, the pressure changes form. It no longer comes from what's revealed, but from what can't be unseen. The documentary stops feeling like a release and starts feeling like a record, not built to shock, but to endure. Because records don't rely on outrage. They rely on recall. What becomes clear is a misunderstanding many people have about power. Power rarely collapses when exposed. It adapts, it slows, it quiets itself, because silence, when deployed carefully, buys time. And time has always been the safest hiding place for unfinished stories. But this time isn't erasing anything. It's accumulating it. Every resurfaced interview lands differently. Every old clip carries added weight. Statements once perceived as neutral now feel engineered, not false, but incomplete by design, crafted to satisfy the moment without leaving a trail. That's the tension beneath everything now. Not shock, not outrage, awareness. The focus shifts from individual moments to the ecosystem that allowed those moments to repeat. The silences of allies, the continuity of business, the media narratives that softened scrutiny instead of sharpening it, the structures that held firm through every storm. Because one truth becomes unavoidable. This was never just about image protection. It was about system preservation. As pressure grew over the years, nothing collapsed outwardly. Strategies evolved instead. Criticism was reframed. Accusations were redirected. Legal scrutiny prompted layering not to erase events, but to manage their memory. The documentary quietly reveals something many missed in real time. How moments of crisis were often followed by strategic visibility appearances, statements, carefully timed interviews designed to reinforce who someone was supposed to be, not who people were beginning to question. When family entered the frame, that strategy intensified. Unity became proof. Loyalty became defense. Inquiry was recast as attack. Gradually, the conversation shifted from accountability to protection. But defenses only hold as long as their premise goes unchallenged. What's different now is that the premise itself is under examination. The film never argues that one person caused everything. Instead, it offers a more unsettling insight. Unchecked influence creates continuity. Environments shape behavior. Power learned early doesn't disappear, it scales. That's why this story doesn't conclude with scandal or celebrity. It loops back to origins, to how norms are formed, to how boundaries are blurred, to how silence is taught long before it's ever used strategically. In the final moments, the past resurfaces with clarity. Old interviews replayed through a new lens. Casual remarks heard without the cushion of context. Celebrated moments now carrying an undertone that can't be ignored. This isn't about rewriting history. It's about finally being able to read it without interference. This is also where the legal and media tension reaches its quiet peak. Cease and desist letters, public denials, accusations of defamation, none of them appearing when the first documentary aired, but surfacing only once word began spreading about what was coming next. That timing matters. It suggests awareness. It suggests concern. It suggests this material reaches closer to something sensitive than anything released before. And that's why attention sharpens here, not just from fans or critics, but from institutions, platforms, and corporate partners. People who once stood comfortably nearby begin reassessing their distance. Because once a narrative tips, it doesn't wait for consent. In the final stretch, the story returns to the present. New projects, new documentaries, renewed attempts to regain narrative control. But the contrast is unavoidable. On one side, a carefully polished message of resilience and misunderstanding. On the other, years of footage, testimony, and recurring patterns that refuse to remain isolated. The viewer isn't asked to decide guilt or innocence. They're asked to decide what they believe. The version being offered now, or the version that emerges when everything is placed side by side. And the most lasting effect here isn't outrage, it's clarity. Clarity about how power operates, how systems protect themselves, how influence is inherited quietly, how truth rarely arrives all at once, but leaks slowly until ignoring it requires more effort than confronting it. That's why the story doesn't end when the documentary does. It enters a new phase one, where every past decision, every relationship, every silence is reconsidered under sustained light. And once that light is on, it doesn't turn off easily. If you followed this far, it's already clear this was never just about one person. It's about how power is built, maintained, and eventually examined. And now that the questions are being asked steadily instead of loudly, time is no longer a place for answers to hide. From here, the story stops advancing through events and starts advancing through reactions, not statements or denials, but behavior. Who speaks now? Who doesn't? Who suddenly tempers language that once sounded confident? Who chooses distance instead of clarity? Because once patterns are visible, reactions become evidence on their own. Something subtle but irreversible happens to the audience. Every new appearance is measured against memory. Every interview is heard differently. Every silence is compared to the ones that came before. Nothing exists in isolation anymore. Everything becomes contextual. This is the shift. Power resists most because power depends on fragmentation, on time separating moments before memory can connect them. But memory has caught up. The documentary doesn't force this realization. It lets accumulation do the work. Years of moments once spaced apart are compressed until they begin to resemble a single shape. And shape implies design. What becomes unsettling is how predictable the responses are once the system is visible. The pauses arrive in familiar places. The language softens around the same topics. Accountability is acknowledged in broad terms, then redirected before it can land anywhere specific. Nothing false. Nothing provable, just enough distance to prevent closure. Distance isn't accidental here, it's the method. Once that method is recognized, the past reorganizes itself. Old interviews sound different. Confidence once taken at face value feels rehearsed. Statements previously accepted without hesitation, now read as carefully engineered, designed to say something without committing to anything. Silence stops feeling neutral. It no longer reads as maturity or restraint. It begins to look like choice. And not a one-time choice, but a repeated one. The film never states this outright. It doesn't accuse. It observes. And sustained observation is harder to escape than outrage. Outrage burns quickly. Observation lingers. The audience's role changes permanently. Viewers aren't waiting for a reveal anymore. They're waiting for alignment, for someone to address the whole picture rather than fragments. Fragments can be managed, gaps cannot. At this point, the story no longer needs new footage to remain active. It feeds on absence, on what isn't said, what's avoided, how long certain conversations have been left unfinished. Unfinished conversations don't disappear. They accumulate pressure. Not pressure that explodes, but pressure that tightens. The documentary leans into that tension. It slows down. It lets silences stretch just long enough to register discomfort. It shows how often moments that could bring clarity are followed instead by redirection. Not denial, redirection. Denial invite confrontation. Redirection invites patience. And patience has always favored those in control. But patience depends on forgetting, and forgetting isn't happening anymore. Old clips are no longer evaluated in isolation. They're weighed against everything that came before and everything that followed. Tone is measured, timing is questioned. Word choice is examined not by critics, but by memory itself. This is where the documentary becomes threatening to systems rather than individuals. It doesn't destabilize through exposure, it destabilizes through coherence. Once behaviors repeat, once strategies align, once distance looks consistent, the story no longer needs momentum. It has gravity. Gravity doesn't rush. It pulls. And the closer everything gets, the harder it becomes to maintain separation without appearing intentional. That's why off-screen reactions matter more than on-screen statements now. Not the volume of response, but its shape. Limited engagement, carefully framed language, expressions of concern that never touch substance. These aren't random decisions. They're made by people who understand how narratives endure. But endurance isn't resolution, and the audience can feel the difference. What once seemed like a story that would fade now feels suspended, held in place by questions that refuse to expire. Not aggressive questions, structural ones. Why was this never addressed fully? Why did clarity always stop short? Why did time do more work than explanation? These aren't accusations. They're observations. And observations don't require belief. They require attention. By the time the viewer reaches this stage, something else becomes clear. The story isn't ending. It's entering a phase where every future action will be interpreted through what's already been seen. Every silence adds context. Every statement adds contrast. Every attempt to move forward without reckoning with the past reinforces the pattern instead of breaking it. That's the weight underneath everything now. Not spectacle, not drama. Recognition. And recognition changes how stories live. They stop being moments. They become memory. Memory doesn't fade just because attention shifts. It waits until the shape becomes impossible to deny. This is where the loop closes. Not with a conclusion, but with awareness. Once awareness settles in, the story no longer needs to be pushed. It stays, and whatever comes next will be read through everything that came before. By now, the story doesn't need momentum to survive. It has settled into expectation. Expectation that the past will resurface. Expectation that every new move will be measured against what was never resolved. Expectation that silence will no longer function the way it once did. This is the stage where systems feel pressure without anyone raising their voice. Not driven by outrage, but by consistency, by how often the same choices reappear under different circumstances, by how reliably distance is chosen over alignment, by how predictably clarity stops just short of completion. The documentary doesn't explain this, it lets the viewer experience it. You begin to notice how carefully language is managed, how concern is acknowledged without creating anchors, how phrasing is reused across years, across contexts, across entirely different controversies. And reuse tells you something important. It tells you these responses aren't spontaneous. They're practiced, refined, adjusted just enough to fit the moment without ever closing the loop. That's the pattern now visible. What once felt like discretion now feels deliberate. What once felt like patience now reads as strategy. What once felt like maturity now feels protective. This is where people stop asking whether something happened and start asking how it was handled. Because when handling repeats, process becomes the story. And the documentary leans into that truth without naming it, showing again and again how moments of accountability are followed by deflection disguised as composure. Attention is rerouted without resistance. Stories are eased rather than confronted. Nothing explosive, nothing overt, just control. And control exercised quietly lasts far longer than control imposed loudly. That's why this phase feels uneasy. Not because it uncovers something new, but because it eliminates uncertainty about what has long been visible. It exposes how many chances existed to resolve things plainly, and how reliably those chances were sidestepped. Once that pattern registers, it becomes impossible to stop seeing it elsewhere. Past interviews begin to sound different. Statements once received with generosity now feel carefully limited. Moments previously dismissed as isolated start lining up with an accuracy that's hard to ignore. This is where coincidence breaks down. And when coincidence falls apart, intention enters the frame, not legal intent, but structural intent. The way power anticipates scrutiny, the way it braces for pressure, the way it prioritizes survival over resolution. The documentary never claims outcomes were engineered. Instead, it reveals something quieter. Familiarity. Familiarity with the process. Familiarity born of experience. Experience shaped by repetition. And repetition is what turns individual behavior into a system. This is also when viewers understand why this story feels unlike others. There's no engineered climax to release tension, no definitive moment designed to bring closure because closure would allow the story to end. Instead, the tension is deliberately sustained. Sustaining it is the point. By letting questions remain open without inflaming them, the documentary ensures they stay present. Unanswered questions don't provoke defense, they create vigilance. And vigilance is dangerous to systems that depend on exhaustion. Exhaustion makes people stop connecting dots, stop remembering, stop comparing. But exhaustion isn't taking hold here, because the audience isn't being asked to react emotionally. They're being asked to watch carefully, and careful watching doesn't drain people the way outrage does. As time passes, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Those closest to the center are no longer directing the narrative, they're reacting to it. Reaction is inherently defensive. Control is anticipatory. The shift between the two is subtle but decisive. When power sets the narrative, it defines the frame. When it responds, it inherits the frame instead. That frame now belongs to memory. Not memory tied to a single release or moment, but memory stretched across years, across interviews, across absences, across silence. That's why every new development feels heavier than it should. Not because of what it contains, but because of where it lands within a much larger sequence. This is when the audience realizes the turning point already happened quietly, without ceremony. It wasn't a reveal. It was recognition. Recognition that the story doesn't require fresh evidence to remain active. It requires engagement, and that engagement is happening inwardly, not performatively. Fewer arguments, more observation, more attention to what's addressed and what's consistently avoided. That kind of attention doesn't fade, it accumulates, and accumulation is what systems fear most. Because once enough context builds, even silence becomes expressive. Every non-answer adds weight. Every delay sharpens the question. Every attempt to move forward without reckoning reinforces the pattern rather than dissolving it. This is where pressure sustains itself. The documentary doesn't need escalation anymore. Its work is already done. It has altered how time, response, and accountability are perceived. And once those perceptions shift, they don't reset. Nothing that comes next will be judged in isolation. It will be measured against everything that came before. That's the weight beneath the story now, not suspense, not anticipation, but inevitability. Because once patterns become visible, the future stops feeling open-ended. It begins to feel like continuation. And continuation, when observed closely enough, eventually demands resolution. At this stage, something irreversible has occurred. The audience has stopped waiting for answers. They're watching for alignment between words and timing, between past statements and present behavior, between what's said publicly and what's quietly avoided. And once people start watching this way, the story transforms, because alignment is difficult to sustain falsely over time. The documentary leans into this without calling attention to it. Moments from different years begin to echo each other, not in substance, but in response. The same pauses, the same calibrated language, the same retreat just as clarity approaches. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels rehearsed. and rehearsal implies familiarity. This is where the narrative shifts from isolated choices to instinct honed through years of managing attention, knowing when to speak, when to wait, when to let time absorb the impact instead. Time has always been the most reliable shield, but shields only work when no one is examining them. What's changed is the examination. Quiet, methodical, unemotional. The documentary doesn't announce this shift, you sense it in the pacing, in the space left between scenes, in the way silence is allowed to remain unfilled. Silence becomes communication, and when silence repeats, it stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling intentional. Viewers begin to notice something uncomfortable. Many of the most consequential moments were never concealed. They were always visible. They simply weren't examined together. Old interviews, casual remark, offhand moments that seemed harmless alone. Side by side, they lose that harmlessness not because they prove anything, but because they form a pattern. And patterns don't require explanation, they require acknowledgement. The documentary never instructs the audience what to believe. It doesn't push conclusions. It doesn't escalate emotionally. It removes separation. And once moments are no longer isolated, each one gains weight from the others. Pauses stretch. Answers feel abbreviated. Silence carries gravity. This is when discomfort shifts, not because of new information, but because of coherence. Viewers begin revisiting memories they didn't realize they had archived, statements accepted without resistance, moments assumed complete because no one questioned them. Now they return with friction, and friction generates awareness. The focus subtly moves from individuals to responses. Not what happened then, but how it's being handled now. Who engages, who withdraws, who adjusts language, who creates distance. These responses aren't random. They occur under pressure, not accusatory pressure, but observational pressure. Observation is harder to deflect because it asks nothing. It waits, and waiting, paired with memory, becomes force. This is why this phase feels heavier than anything before it. There's no promise of a reveal, no endpoint in sight. Closure would dissipate the tension. Instead, the tension settles into perception, into interpretation, into how every future action will now be read. The story no longer needs events to remain alive. Every response becomes an event. Every silence becomes data. The documentary doesn't explain this. It allows the audience to feel it. An experience lasts longer than explanation. What becomes clear is that the real transformation isn't happening on screen. It's happening in how people watch. They're no longer consuming. They're comparing. Then to now, tone to tone, silence to silence. Comparison strips away protective ambiguity. What once felt vague begins to feel deliberate. What once seemed accidental begins to look structured. This is where power loses one of its strongest defenses: uncertainty. Uncertainty allows multiple interpretations to coexist. Patterns collapse them into one, and once that collapse occurs, even inaction becomes meaningful. That's why the documentary slows instead of rushing forward. Momentum is no longer the objective. Recognition is. Recognition that the story has entered a phase where it can't be bypassed, where time no longer softens perception, where silence no longer resets the narrative. The audience senses this shift even if they can't articulate it. And once it happens, their attention changes permanently. They stop asking what happens next. They start asking how long this has been happening. And that question doesn't fade. It deepens. This is how the loop tightens, not through spectacle, but through continuity. Continuity of behavior, continuity of response, continuity of silence. And once continuity is recognized, it can't be unseen. What follows won't feel like a new chapter. It will feel like an extension of something ongoing, because the story isn't advancing anymore. It's converging. By the time it reaches this stage, it no longer feels like something unfolding in real time. It feels like something that's been unfolding for years and is only now being understood all at once. That's the distinction. Nothing new needs to happen for the weight to grow. The weight already exists. It comes from alignment from moments once separated, now resting side by side without resistance. This is when the audience realizes the most significant shift didn't occur within the film. It occurred within them. They're no longer watching to be surprised. They're watching to confirm what they already sense. And confirmation doesn't require revelation. It requires consistency. The documentary allows the final stretch to breathe. No rush toward resolution, no tidy ending, because tidy endings allow stories to conclude. This one doesn't conclude, it compresses. Statements resurface, silences accumulate, and accumulation alters memory. You begin to see how often clarity was postponed rather than refused, how explanations hovered just out of reach, how time was asked to do the work accountability never fully did. This isn't framed as guilt. It's framed as behavior, and behavior, repeated often enough, stops being circumstantial. It becomes structural. That realization lingers. The documentary doesn't ask for judgment. It doesn't dictate conclusions. It removes insulation. And once that layer is gone, everything sounds different. Words carry more weight. Pauses feel deliberate. Language feels narrower. Silence becomes dominant. This is when viewers understand why nothing exploded, why there was no dramatic collapse, why the story feels quieter instead of louder. Because power doesn't always shatter. Sometimes it thins, stretching itself across time, distance, and ambiguity. But ambiguity only works if people stop comparing. They haven't. The audience has shifted from reaction to observation, from consumption to tracking, from fragments to patterns. That shift doesn't reverse. Every future action now carries context. Every response is measured. Every absence is noted. That's where the pressure lives now, not in outrage or headlines, but in continuity. Continuity of tone, continuity of restraint, continuity of choices made when clarity would have been simpler. Those choices don't fade. They compound. The documentary leaves viewers at a threshold, not a conclusion, a point where narration is no longer necessary, where memory carries the story forward on its own. This is when the past stops being something that passes. It becomes reference, reference for responses, reference for narratives, reference for silence. And once something becomes reference, it cannot be unseen. That's the lasting effect, not through shock, not through accusation. Recognition that this story was never about one moment or one release. It has always been about how moments are handled repeatedly, how time was used as a buffer, how patience became strategy. The audience senses this before they can articulate it. They understand that whatever comes next will be filtered through everything already observed. The story doesn't end here. It doesn't need to. It's already embedded in memory, in comparison, in how future silence will be interpreted. From this point on, silence will never sound the same. At this stage, something deeper settles in. It doesn't announce itself, but it transforms how the story is perceived. The audience is no longer following a narrative, they are tracking a pattern. Once tracking begins, the story cannot reset. Tracking keeps memory active. Nothing is taken at face value. Every statement, every pause, every carefully chosen word is weighed against what has come before. This is where the real shift occurs. The documentary doesn't need louder revelations or dramatic moments. It relies on familiarity with how pressure is applied, how distance is maintained, how silence appears at critical moments again and again. Repetition at this level stops feeling coincidental. What becomes striking is how predictable responses feel once the pattern emerges. Not boring, predictable, but precise. The same softening of language under scrutiny. The same delay when clarity would matter most. Predictability is dangerous because it strips power of surprise. And surprise is what allows narratives to reset. Without it, every move feels anticipated. That's why the tension here is different. It is not suspense, it is inevitability. You're no longer wondering if something will surface. You're watching how it will be handled when it does. Handling itself becomes the story. The documentary reinforces this subtly, revisiting moments once dismissed as minor interviews that didn't spark headlines, comments that seemed casual, silences that once felt ordinary. When placed together, these moments gain weight. Not because they prove anything, but because they align. Alignment removes plausible deniability, not legally, but narratively. Once alignment is clear, explanations must address the whole picture, not fragments. And addressing the whole picture is riskier than managing isolated moments. That's why fragmentation worked for so long, but fragmentation collapses when viewers start connecting the dots themselves. The documentary doesn't guide them explicitly, it trusts them, and trust changes the relationship between content and audience. You are no longer being led, you are invited to notice. Notice how clarity was postponed, how timelines were incomplete, how conversations pivoted away from specifics. These are observations, not accusations. And observations, once made, do not fade. This is where the weight of continuity emerges, not just continuity of events, but continuity of approach. The same playbook appears across years, subtly refined but fundamentally unchanged. That realization lands quietly, but it lands deep. Once you see the playbook, you stop reacting to individual moves. You begin watching the strategy, and strategy doesn't require constant action. Sometimes restraint is the action restraint in what is said, in what is addressed, in how closely questions are allowed to reach answers. This is why silence now feels heavier than ever. It is no longer empty, it is structured. Structured silence signals planning. Planning signals awareness. And awareness changes how everything is interpreted. The audience doesn't need confirmation of intent. They feel it through consistency. Consistency of tone, timing, and repeated avoidance. Avoidance, repeated enough, becomes positioning. Positioning to endure scrutiny without resolving it. Positioning to let time continue doing the work. But time no longer protects narratives the way it once did. Memory is sharpening. Every resurfaced clip feels clearer. Every repeated phrase narrower. Every delayed response louder. That inversion signals a new environment. The documentary doesn't announce it, you feel it. The ground beneath the story has shifted. Old tools no longer function. Patience no longer guarantees distance. Tension becomes self-sustaining. The story no longer relies on new developments. It relies on anticipation, not of denial, but of alignment. Will the next move acknowledge the full pattern? Or reinforce it? That question sits quietly beneath everything. It does not expire. Every choice answers it. Even choosing not to respond is an answer. The documentary leaves the audience deliberately suspended, not in confusion, but in clarity without closure. Clarity that waits. And waiting, paired with awareness, generates pressure that doesn't dissipate. The audience senses it instinctively. They may not articulate it, but they feel it. The story hasn't ended, not because something new will be released, but because the pattern continues to reveal itself through reactions, and reactions, once observed, tell more than revelations ever could. Here, the loop tightens not through drama, but through expectation. Expectation that silence will carry meaning, that distance will be read, that the past will continue shaping the present. At this stage, the story doesn't need to move forward. It is already everywhere it needs to be. By this point, the story has changed its nature. It is no longer unfolding, it is being observed. And when a story is observed, power is measured. Measurement doesn't require noise. Nothing more needs to surface. The pressure now comes from memory. Memory of how clarity was postponed, of how silence arrived predictably at critical moments. The audience realizes the real shift occurred long before they noticed. It happened when people stopped asking, "What happened?" and began asking, "Why does the response always look like this?" That question doesn't accuse or speculate, it observes. Observation, once shared, cannot be escaped. The documentary leaves the viewer here intentionally, not with answers, but with alignment. Alignment between past behavior and present reaction, between old statements and current distance, between confidence then and restraint now. Once alignment is visible, the story no longer needs explanation. Explanation is only necessary when things feel random. Nothing feels random anymore. What once seemed coincidental now feels consistent. What once seemed isolated now feels connected. What once seemed finished now feels unresolved. Unresolved doesn't mean incomplete, it means active. Silence no longer rests quietly. Every pause adds context. Every non-response becomes part of the perceptual record. Perception does not reset when the screen goes dark. That is why this doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a handoff from content to memory, from narration to comparison, from reaction to recognition. Recognition that this story was never about one moment or one release. It is about how moments were handled repeatedly, how time was used as a buffer, how patience became strategy, how silence was treated as resolution. But silence doesn't resolve. It only delays reckoning, and delay works only when attention fades. Attention hasn't faded, it has sharpened. The audience now watches differently, listens differently, interprets differently. Every statement is weighed, every absence noticed. Every attempt to move forward without addressing the full pattern reinforces it rather than escapes it. This is the quiet consequence, not collapse, not chaos. Continuity. Continuity of observation. Continuity of comparison. Continuity of memory. Once a story lives in memory rather than headlines, it doesn't disappear when cycles move on. It waits. That is where this ends, not with certainty, but with awareness. Awareness that power isn't undone by exposure alone. It is undone when patterns become visible to too many people at once. And once that happens, silence stops protecting its signals. This wasn't about one documentary or one release. It was about how influence operates, how systems protect themselves, and how time has been used as cover. The question now isn't what comes next, it's how everything that comes next will be read. The lens has changed, and once the lens changes, there is no going back.